historical perspective, it is subaltern. There's a huge conceptual diversity to look into who are being pushed out in the periphery for various reasons, structural reason, cultural reason, and possible and the various politics of development, displacement. For that matter, we need to have to understand what are the dynamics, how people are pushed, and what are the strategies and the ways that these people find their voices in the system. So this is a very interdisciplinary perspective that we have to look into it. You can study it from the political economy perspective, informality of work or formality of work. You can look at from the sociological perspective, from caste, class relationship, intersectionality, women, various perspectives. The point is that urban space itself requires a very much interdisciplinary intervention. So in my reading, I have prescribed you one piece on methodology. How do we understand those dynamics? It's a very in order to understand the dynamics and the politics of marginalized community or subaltern communities in the urban space, you need to take multiple approach. You may base yourself into one theoretical tradition, but you can do various innovative ways of things. For example, mixing ethnography plus case studies plus surveys. You can do number of experimental methods, but you have to be clear which questions you are trying to answer. Therefore, reading I have prescribed is a participatory research method, because in order to understand the dynamics, I think one of the major approach to study is to anthropological ethnographic studies plus participatory action. We also look at from the discursive perspective, what kind of voices, what kind of are emerging from the people who are engaged in those kind of struggle. Urban space itself is very in South Asia. I think the various centers of urban spaces like Calcutta, Mumbai, to some extent Chennai, are new modern cities. When colonialism came to our region, these spaces, these centers were evolved as a kind of administrative towns. In earlier times, urban spaces were associated with the pilgrimage. For example, Banaras in India, which is not a capital but a pilgrimage place. So, how does urban space emerge in our region and space is a very important way to look into it. So, you have to do a kind of little bit of historical analysis in terms of state, how state has organized its governance for what purpose. Pilgrimage spaces are much more multiple cultural things converge there, diversity, geography, everything. So, for example, if you take Banaras, who are the marginalized communities in Banaras? Those who work on the cremation ghat, those who work in the basheras and the dharmashalas or in local inns, people coming from outside doing all kinds of service and menial job. At the same time, these religious spaces also had the patronage of the state. So with the state came, the small rulers, big rulers, all converge in the kind of religious space. Similarly, in Calcutta, if you look into the sides of the Ganga River or any big cities, riverside is always seen as a place for, cremations and others. You find a particular kind of community, caste and community, live in and around those vicinities. So what I'm saying is that urban space is a very interesting way to look into how life and economy has merged together to create a kind of, I think, it's a struggle for livability, survivability. At the same time, in our world, part of the world, urban space are also escape from the parochial village. And there's a big debate in the literature. You will find that people from the rural areas, especially village areas, move to cities in search of not only a job and opportunities, but also escape the caste and class operations for that matter. So cities or urban spaces are great liberating spaces. So different aspirations also converge there. So where does this empowerment perspective comes to me is to look into the different kind of narrative that is associated with the people's aspirations. So most of the city space in South Asia first emerged with the colonial states' expansion, trade, or the seat of power. Power and the capital city and power also require market to emerge. For example, if you look into the idea of a frontier towns and cities and urban space, when state went to those areas, police followed, army followed, market followed, and at the same time, workers also followed to work there. So to me, urban space is also a place where mode of production is enacted. Different kind of labor relations are unfolded. So I think for a student of the urban struggle or urban spaces, looking into a city is a very important way to look into a different dynamics. But the point is that can we look into all kind of dynamics? No. For that matter, as a researcher or a student, you have to pick up which questions is important to you and which kind of questions you wanted to answer. So it offers, urban poor studies or urban relationship studies provides you a multiple, perspective and possibilities to engage and build the sound understanding how our cities shape up our relationship. And other important part of looking into the struggle is from the perspective of, cities emerge through the state building associated with the modernity, overcoming of the new technology and industrial, development. So each cities have its own dynamics. For example, Calcutta was a seat of government for many years. Therefore, the kind of education, kind of cultural uh, development that took place associated with the response to how states' power were consolidated in the city. At the same time, city also has needed an economic base. So what kind of economy it was talking about? For example, if you take a Bombay, earlier time, whole Bombay subaltern class was shaped up by the mill workers, cotton mill workers, textile mill workers, dock workers. Similarly, in Calcutta, being an urban space, a service class is important. Same time, the industries also came up with the huge hinterland in Bombay. So every city space has its own dynamics and its own peculiarity. So Nepal is one of the late countries in terms of urban space development and migration because our we have a limited number of cities or the urban space which is worthy of calling urban spaces. Uh, so compared to Indian towns, our Kathmandu or Nepal's urban space is a kind of small towns and bazaars which Bailey talks in the towns and bazaars of the northern India. So it has its own characteristics. But when we say city or urban spaces, it's a basically place of convergence for many reasons. As I said in earlier, in search of livelihood, in search of escape from the suppression and operation opportunities, aspirations. So cities are also aspirations. In that sense, it's a very important to look into modern cities and how that uh, reflects the evolving pattern of social, political, and economic relationship. So, to me, when CRG proposed me to look into this subject, I thought that I should delve in because I'm a institutional political scientist. My forte is basically government, legislative, judiciary, and other things. But politics devoid of a social relationship and economic relationship has no value. So as Madhubanti was introducing me, I've also worked with the trade unions. I've also worked into organizing informal sectors into trade unions. So that, for that matter, I have a great interest to working class. And working without working class, cities has no meaning. But in our time, the nature of working class has also changed. It was earlier industrial working class. In a traditional trade union language, it was blue collar workers. They were in the beginning not organized, but later they be organized. As service sector grew in the cities and urban space, then came the white collar workers. Now we have a colorless worker, which is called gig worker. They do all kinds of job. They don't know who their the master or employer is, but big companies and corporations. In a way, capitalism and modern technology has made these workers or those who work in the system a colorless. And colorless is a very my own sense when I came with this phrase as a colorless worker. That means how do we organize? How do they work? How do they demand? Whom would they demand? What are their, aspirations? How does their aspirations reflected in the system? What kind of social contract and negotiation, social dialogue takes place? I think these are the challenges with the newer type of emerging issues. For this newer type of technologies, yes, urban spaces provide the number of economy of number and scale. Therefore, you find many people, but you don't need to be located into particular area to articulate articulate the demand and your work, because you can work from anywhere. All you need is a kind of look at my current situation. I'm speaking you. It could be anywhere in the airport. So yeah, I'm in a Delhi airport, but it may be Istanbul. It may be. So I think we live in a all politics and struggle seems to be territorial. But because of this new technology and other things, struggles have also been it's taken a different shape. And I'm an old class person. The new form of struggle that takes place in the cyberspace or in a virtual world, how powerful it is. Do we control the technology? Do we control the work so that we can demand? Since it has also worked as a multi-center design or the structure, therefore one section stopping the work or demanding something else cannot stop whole work. So I think the workers have been losing, all the subaltern class is losing their voice and the physical force. And I'm reminded of one of the lecture that I heard in my long association with the CRG was, all politics is territorial. Iran Opakal talked about, territoriality of a politics. But suddenly, deterritorializing of politics and space has led to a new methodological question in our study of struggle and the negotiations. So these are some of the things. And if you look into my readings, these readings are basically a kind of preliminary reading to kindle your interest. One is a methodological, one is on Nepal's Dalit and planning, other is on minority studies. So I have taken on different studies from different places to make it a kind of I don't know who the participants are and what kind of disciplinary background they come from. So that's why I chose four different kinds of studies. One from the minority perspective in South Asia, other from the Dalit in the Nepal's development and political process. One is more of a theoretical article, and one is a research approach article. And I hope you'll find those reading interesting and important. Since I'm traveling, I will not take more time. You may have some, what you call, lecture following my brief presentation. I'm really sorry that I could not do a justice for the people who are joining from different places, but I think I have made my point in a very concise way. If not, you can always reach to me because program will share my email and phone numbers. I'll be available Tuesday onward in my station, and then I will be responding whatever concerns and queries you have. But at least I can at least some of you wanted to raise questions about what I said just now, I'm happy to engage with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. The participants, if they have any questions, we will now be taking questions. You could either put them in the chat box or use the raise hands option.
Madhuvarti, since I'm taking from the phone, please help me to read the question, okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon or good
Yes,
evening.
Hanif.
Yeah.
Hanif, yes. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to greet my express for giving me the opportunity to ask a question to Professor Amir. Professor, I have a questions, maybe a simple questions. You said that urban space cannot only view in one perspective, but have to use different kind of perspective because if we talk about urban spaces, it is a complicated things that cannot only view in one kind of, for example, using only one kind of theory. And how can you explain to us to specifically use a certain theory to understand about the phenomenon in urban spaces? Thank you very much.
I think one of the best way to look into urban phenomena is to through kind of participatory observation. You have to understand what city is like. You know, for example, if you where are you from?
I'm from Indonesia, Prof.
Okay.
From Jakarta, yeah.
Okay. People going to Jakarta, for example, I have visited Jakarta many times. When I go to Jakarta, big cities don't change much in terms of infrastructure. Big cities change what people talk about, what people eat, what are the the kind of conversation that goes into society in a you can use the James Scott way of thinking. There are hidden transcript of resistance. James Scott talk about rural spaces, but in a big cities, I cannot visualize what is transpiring in terms of political discourse within the in the Indonesian society in a Jakarta space. I may be talking to a couple of people, but people who live there, live for certain years, understand the kind of symbols, use of sarcasm, different kind of conversation among the people. So big cities, especially urban space, yes, in our days when it's expanded, in terms of infrastructure, there are some visible change. But to me, cities are not only infrastructure, cities are about people. So how do people view the changes or power dynamics in society? In some cities, people can openly discuss, newspaper and other things. And in our times, much of the things happen in the cyberspace. Much of a thing happen in Instagram, TikTok, and a casual visitor or researcher staying there for a week cannot make sense what is happening in the cities. Therefore, to me, urban space is much more complex than the village system. Village system is also complex. For an anthropologist, they say that in order to understand your study in the village, you have to spend one research cycle. Means that you have to be there for 1 year, where every rituals of the society can be observed, recorded, noted, and there is a death in the within the society. There's a birth. There's a different rituals. Through that, you can extract the meaning, symbolism. The very famous anthropologist Clifford Gersh studied the Indonesia, and he said the symbolism. In order to understand the symbolism, you have to understand the rituals and the society. That's what I'm saying. For example, for a political economist, he cannot use this methodology. He would look into the data. He would look into how people, they would take a big survey. What is the situation of inequality? What is the situation of access to public roads? So that's a different kind of study. For example, how many poor people can afford to the bus can be done through the quantitative survey. Whereas, in order to enhance the nuance change in the society for urban space and the aspirations of struggle, you have to look into more ethnographic or qualitative. But there is no one way to look into it. But different approaches take different methodological perspective. So this is what I'm saying. If your discipline is more cultural study oriented, you want to look into the cultural dynamics, you cannot do the survey. in a cultural dynamics. You can do a survey, how many people drink Coca-Cola? That's the thing, kind of thing. It's a very market perspective thing. But in order to understand how values and their struggles are changing every day and what are the issues involved in a deeper meaning, we need to do a much more ethnographic approach. This is what I'm saying. I hope I made myself clear.
Thank you very much, Professor.
We will now take a question from Pian Pachong.
Where is he from?
Hi, Professor Harris and everyone. I am Pian Pachong from Thailand.
Oh, great.
Yes, nice to meet you, and thank you so much for your insight. I just want to make sure that I understand your wisdom correctly. So earlier you begin with saying the urban space starts with economic dynamics and the struggle of working class people. And so that reminds me of some of the new cities that we see in like recent years that is kind of created by the government. Like, for example, I never been to any of those cities, but from what I heard and what I read, we talk about like still like Canberra, like Australia, or Naypyidaw in Myanmar, where the government just decided that, okay, we're gonna put the like whatever capital governmental organizations over there and make it a city. So in that sense, we couldn't call those places like urban space, right? Because it just have like functions, but it doesn't have let's say economic or social dynamics, like organic like relationships that you were mentioned earlier that create meanings of urban life.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I got a point. It's a very interesting observation, which I fully agree with you. There is a beautiful work by James Scott, who's a political anthropologist who died 2 years back, wrote Seeing Like a State. Why big schemes of urbanizations or intervention, state intervention, planning intervention has failed. So I studied in India, a place called Chandigarh, which was created as a city space, administrative city after the partition of India, Pakistan. When they built city, it was a beautiful city in terms of, hospitals, building, parks and blah, blah. But when people move in, who moved in? Basically, it was an administrative city. Therefore, only government official moved in. And in a colonial mentality, we don't do our own work. So when these officers and their families, school, professors, everything was started. Gate number 6. So what happened was that once cities started, people started living there. They need washermen, they need milk supply, they needed, looking after their young kids because they go to work. So a lot of working class people had to come in. And because it was created in the middle of the nowhere in the urban, like a rural India, people would like have a fresh milk. So buffalo came in, cows came in. The designer and planner never thought that the city would require this kind of thing. So there's a different dynamics began. And people said that, oh, this was a beautiful city, but suddenly it became ugly. And then it's a very strange way. You start seeing your own people from the ugly perspective. The people who clean your toilet, do utensils, comfort as ayahs and other things. They are not supposed to be in the cities, but suddenly they came because you need an economy to sustain your prosperity. For example, in India, there's a city called Bombay, which is a financial capital of India. You see a 70-story building, a 30-story building. Who delivers food? And people who deliver food, who clean those offices, do not stay in the city. They cannot afford the space in the city. Where they go? They go to squatters. So in that sense, what I see is that in economy, you need people to work, you need to consume, you need to, profit. So it's a different dynamics. Generally, development planners only see things in in a plain paper, but suddenly when people start living and inheriting, it has its own dynamics. Okay, you, for example, rich people have a driver, and driver, if you allow to driver to stay at your home, you cannot separate him or her from a family. You bring in, then suddenly responsibility starts beginning. So what I'm saying is that the organically city, even if it is created like a Nepido, I've been to Nepido, uh, once it starts taking life. So question is, what makes city a city? Okay, can city be like an airport terminal, clean and span? But in airport, you see all kind of people traveling. There are fancy duty-free shop at the same time, vending machine. So one of the great example of a city in our region is a Singapore. Singapore has a very limited space, but because of the Singapore government's policy intervention, they have kept the park and public space open. They made public transportation much cheaper and accessible. Tax hire people for taking car into inner cities. So this is where policy comes in, because if you don't do that, there will be no social harmony. Singapore's fundamental thing is a harmony. How do you create harmony? It looks like a very authoritarian, but they cannot ignore the poor in Singapore. In order to keep poor happy, they need to have a public transportation. In order to make poor happy, they need to have a public, park, so that the public education system. Singapore is a highly unequal society, but in terms of access to public services, it's the most egalitarian society in our region. So there are different ways to look into it. So if you wanted to study urban poor in Singapore, you need to identify their character. They all come with their own character, but it cannot be a generic. But theory building exercise begins with the small bits and pieces to create generalization. Theory is about generalization, explaining possibilities and explaining the difficult questions to that to come. But you have to it's a kind of building blocks of theory. So I don't know what your interests are when you do a paper or you take your study. You have to take, and there has to be some kind of, in order to study subaltern groups or marginalizations or minority, you have to have a feel for it. It cannot be only ivory tower vocations or interest to study those things. So I think Calcutta Research Group believes in that kind of thing. You have to believe in. That's why I prescribe the participatory action research methodology piece to precisely build that point. I hope I made, it's a very big, all over kind of answer, but I hope you can understand it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Shahryar Haq.
Thank you for your lecture and your explanation of the question. Whenever people talk about city or urban spaces, they talk about external spaces. Now, I'm particularly interested in social spaces within the workplace, particularly a term called new working spaces, which Ray Oldenburg has defined as the third space. Third space means the first space is like home, second space is like work, and then in between you have the third space. And if these are included in organizations, then there's a sense of well-being, and the work-life balance is there. And quite often we see in organizations, they have their little desks, they don't have any third space, and as a result, there's burnouts, particularly in urban cities. So I would like your perspective regarding this in the workplace. The concept of this third space or social place.
I think the workspace has been designed and evolved over the period of time. For example, earlier there used to be a cabin, now there's a cubicles, now there's a transparent floor system. And then in workspace, people, because of the space constraint and productivity issues, it has becoming more open. And privacy was very much important part of the earlier phase of modernity, private versus public. So if you work in the offices at the same time, you're a part of larger group, but you are still a private person. How do you protect your privacy in terms of your what you eat, what you dress up? But suddenly, these are sometimes it's like a fad. Sometimes you have open space working, no cubicles, glass, see-through halls, and
Right.
nowadays people only take their computers and go to choose any desk. But nonetheless, when we say organization in terms of modern organization or a capitalist organization, it's a very much of hierarchy because there's an external boundary, and then a person who leaves home early in the morning is a worker or a manager, but because of the access to resources, all of us travel in a bus. There's no hierarchy in the bus, but when you go into the office, there is a hierarchy. But
Right.
at the same time, how do you manage that hierarchy? And then it has been oscillating between differences and the openness, closeness and the openness. It's a different management style. So these are basically intervention from the management in terms of raising productivity, but not to care about human work-life balance is a very ploy, I think. Um, Nobody they want you to be happy because they want you to be more productive. So once you engage in that kind of contract or that kind of engagement, you always you need to follow the what organizational principles and guidelines. It's like an advertisement are luring. For example, the insurance. The insurance is basically lure you to, the hard days will come, please invest. You invest, but when hard days come, it becomes very difficult. So similarly, it are to me a kind of relationship that the modern management has brought in. Work-life balance is very important, but work-life balance is very important in terms of what kind of, as you said, your cultural and social space where you create your well-being. You spend 8 hours with your inside your office, but you still wanted to go out then with a dinner or go to bar for a drinking in the evening, and you carry your office conversation along with that. So I think it's very difficult to create that kind of balance. There's been basically innovations going on. I have also managed the organization for many years. We have talked about it, but there is no one way. Consultant would provide do this, don't do this, but it depends on a different organizational leadership or the ethos and values. Some promote work, some promote well-being. For example, the new way of working in Google and other places, it has become much more flexible. Ultimately, productivity matter. This is what they say. Pandemic has also given us that situation because you can work from place where you want. But in our society, if you work from home, your parents and family would say that you have been not working. Working from home doesn't mean work to many of us. So it's also a cultural issue, brother.
Yeah.
So I'm not an expert on management. As I said, I did manage the organization, but it was always a difficult dilemma and challenge. So once this course progresses, I'll be interacting with all of you through various means, and I also read new issues and things in the future for the future.
Okay,
Madhuvanti.
thank you.
Madhuvanti,
Yes, sir.
please kindly note the thing, and because I've been asked to report to the gate, so I'm proceeding there. If you
Okay,
don't
but
mind, I'm really sorry.
okay. Okay, sir. It's okay.
How
It's
many
all right.
questions
I
there?
will.
How many questions
There are
still there?
three. There are three more questions.
So I would like to listen them one by one quickly, and then try to make sense out of it.
Okay, Asma Puttasaini, could you? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'll make my question very quick. I just wanted to ask that you mentioned that urban spaces are liberating spaces. So I wanted to know if this, how true is this? Because a lot of the times the discrimination that is present in the rural areas gets translated to cities as well. For example, how Dalits are treated in the village, that gets translated to cities as well. So can you give more examples about how urban spaces are liberating? Yes.
No, it is basically earlier times, it was a great refuge. If you escape from that, but as an individual you escape, but together with you, others will also escape. So that way, it theoretically, yes, is a great refuge. For example, when train came in, nobody knew who is caste. Technology at the beginning was a great equalizer for many of us in our region. But technology also differentiated. Gandhiji was thrown out of the train because he was a brown or black. So there is always a power instrument there, and social relationships are always reinvented in the urban space. But as you said, rightly said. But there is a possibility that you'll hide your identities there, because there are many people coming from different places. So in the beginning of the century, I think the urban space were more liberating space, and I think the many people who escaped from Nepal, the caste hierarchy and the the marriage within the same kinship groups and others escaped Darjeeling. And Darjeeling Nepali population in Darjeeling, every Nepali is, for that matter, every Nepali in Dehradun is known as a Thapa, generic name. So there are different ethnographic studies to suggest that you are right in terms of caste and other things. These are very difficult subjects, but in the beginning, because of the technology mediated thing, I can give you one example. When we had washing machine coming our home, mothers get relieved, because the male folks in the family said that women can't handle the technology. We do it. So it was a very liberating for the women coming of a washing machine in a whole family. Similarly, the vacuum cleaner. But once everybody accommodated it, women had to do vacuum cleaning, washing clothes, and go to office also. So in the beginning, it gives that, but we could not create the consolidated position on that. So there are different ways to look into it. Is technology egalitarian? Is urban space egalitarian? But social space, the social relations are manifested in different ways. It's a similar way with the great egalitarian religions. When they come from outside, traditional, traditional tribal societies or indigenous societies are much more egalitarian. But when they interact with the majoritarian system of caste and hierarchy thing, they also turn to similar things. So it's a power is reinvented through different means. There's no one way that we can say that, but it was a starting point. How do we see urban spaces? And I began with this liberating space, but the different kind of power, reproduction of power and economy continues to do that. That's why we change rarely. We see the change very outwardly, but in a deeper, societies don't change that fast. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Would you be able to take another question?
Please, one.
Yes, sir. So the next question is from Joanna.
Yes, hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your sharing. I just wanted to ask a bit more about the what you mentioned about digital ethnography in urban versus village spaces. So I'm from Singapore, but doing research in the Philippines in a fishing village. So yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts about how we can analyze digital ethnography and what to look out for urban versus village spaces. Thank you.
Okay, I think the technology is constantly evolving, and you have to understand how technology operates, because many of us in our part of the world, especially South Asia, I'm coming from there, we don't produce technologies, we use technologies. So there's a different way. So basically, get into the algorithm of the dynamics. You have to understand how technology works. So, so great challenge to understand, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and which has been even, made difficult by the AI in our times. So this is the tension that I see with the real and virtual spaces. You got my point. So I don't have much of an answer on that. So please, we'll. I think this is a very important question, and I'll note this.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Madhuvanti, please give me.
Yes, sir. There are a couple of more questions, but I will forward them to you. And
Yes.
I think we can respond to them later. So
This
thank
is
you
a
very
sudden
much.
development in the family, so I had to rush to Delhi. So I'm at both. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your lecture, sir, in spite of your busy schedule. Thank you. We will be forwarding your questions to Mr. Hari Sharma, and we will get back to you with the answers. We now move on to the next session, which is the keynote lecture of the course, which will be delivered by Professor Amin. As always, we request you to kindly put your questions in the chat box or raise your hands later when the lecture is over. They will be addressed after the lecture. To introduce the speaker, Professor Amin is the Emeritus 1931 Chair of Geography at Cambridge University and a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation. He is also a fellow of the Humanities Urban Future Program at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR. Professor Amin is known for his extensive work in urban, cultural, and economic geography. Some of his notable publications include Land of Strangers, Seeing Like a City, and After Nativism, Belonging in an Age of Intolerance. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity, and let's get going. Here's an opening quote for you to think a little bit about, because it kind of frames my talk. So here is the premise of my talk, and I think this is a truism. Cities now find themselves on the front line of the dangers of climate change, diverse emergencies, failing infrastructures, the rise of centripetal authority, and prolonged austerity. So in these cities, the future for their unprotected majorities looks foreclosed, shut out, and increasingly manipulated by those with most power and resource to protect their own interests. And it seems to me that we're back to an earlier age of the urban remaindered having to rely on what they can gather up in adversity and insecurity by themselves. And if this is true, perhaps then we need to better understand the ecologies of such gathering up. What being remaindered takes away, but also retains. And John Berger's reflection on how the past lingers, I think, is a useful provocation. And this is what a group of us are attempting within the program that you kindly referred to, funded by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, called Humanities Urban Future. And what a small group of us are trying to do is we're trying to look at the habits that I learned, or maybe learned, under duress when stressed neighborhoods, in our case study cities, Mexico City, Naples, Kinshasa, and Lagos, what they managed to gather, the vernaculars of makeshift, the technicities of co-produced infrastructures, any ethics of care formed in what we call in a forthcoming book, in the dispositions of foregoing, of letting go. And what we're interested in this book is in what we call the double blackness of denial, of deprivation, if you like, but also waywardness. Echoing writing on colonial plantation legacies, this time formed in the context of the unlivable urban. So we're finding how in prolonged periods of distress and denial, the negotiation of time seems different. Echoing Giorgio Agamben's description of the contemporary as neither preordained or preformed, but instead, he says in this quote, and he implies in this quote that the contemporary is an anachronism with its own dynamic and potentiality. And in his essay on contemporariness, he writes that contemporariness is an anachronism that permits us to grasp our time in the form of a too soon that is also too late, of an already that is also a not yet. I quote, "It allows us to recognize in the obscurity of the present the light that, without ever being able to reach us, is perpetually voyaging towards us." So essentially, what Agamben is saying about the contemporary is that it is a caesura, it is a temporality with its own logic and hidden potentiality. It's different. It is not a passage point between past and future. So what I want to do today is to dwell on this long momentary, firstly by delving into what is opened up by thinking urban time in this way, and then by offering an illustration from a coastal settlement popularly called the Black Heart of Naples in Italy. But first then, a thought on the urban chronotype. It is common in urban historiography to think of cities as palimpsests of past layers of fabric worked into the present. And here, rather like the ancient reuse of scraped papyrus, where the old markings are still faintly visible when reused, cities are understood to gather remnants of the past, which are revealed in their ruins, in excavations, in reconstructions, in cartographic overlays. The remnants are the record of memory and of legacy, of the stones and the technicities on which the new unfolds, warning us against thinking and planning the city as a kind of clean slate, as a tabula rasa. What the notion of the palimpsest reveals is the stratified city, its past layers either concealed or reworked into the present. And in a recent subtle refinement based on her work in Istanbul and Rome, Nadia Bartolini suggests another word. She says that the word brecciation may be a better geological metaphor to capture urban evolution, indicating not so much the layering of things from the past, but the fusion of many past built forms, technologies, and organizational practices. So for Bartolini, we should think of the urban history as a chronotype of agglutination, of amalgamation, and not stratification. Well, whichever the better descriptor of urban time, of urban chronicity, be it palimpsestic or brachiated, the history of city making, of course, as we know, is riddled with clean slate vanities. In our own times, preparations for tough times ahead through algorithmic intelligence are a very good example. In cities of the North, computational dives into mass data to simulate future trends and to spot developments are driving city plans on how to organize, where to position, and what to avoid or cultivate, politicians and planners. The premise on the future here is synchronicity, sensing diachronicity to be superseded by simultaneous time-space interactions behaving a bit like neural networks. Algorithmic planning in the North sees only a ceaseless present of emergent developments prompted by unanticipated developments such as pandemics and wars or complexity at work, requiring a technoscience, it is believed, of lateral capture. That is, the smart city of mass data fed through algorithmic intelligence to simulate the probable, to anticipate the improbable, and to ride the emergent, and absolutely to remain the past. The past simply gets in the way because the future will have no bearing on it. But the temporal hinterland is not likely to disappear because when you think about it, spillover, excess, makes cities what they are. Cities are densities of past fabrications, arrivals from everywhere, intersections of multiple temporalities. Cities are amalgams of difference and overflow in their interactions, making time and space. Their chronicity, in truth, is durational, not in the same sense of continuing sameness, but in the way that Bergson intended when he wrote of lived and historical time as, I quote, succession without absolute distinction, and which then later Gilles Deleuze interpreted as, I quote, the eternal present, unquote, of immanent forces of recursion, which are then, of course, instantiated differently in changing circumstances. Now, to me, a perfect allegory of this chronicity can be found in Italo Calvino's novel Invisible Cities, when Marco Polo tells Kublai Khan of the cities that he has seen on his travels, where the cities where they adorn their pasts, I quote, like the lines of a hand, written in the corners of the street, the gratings of the windows, the banisters of the steps, the antennae of the lightning rods, every segment marked with scratches, indentations, and scrolls. Marco Polo tells Kublai Khan about seeing different places in his travels. Utopia, where life forever moves up and down like a chessboard. Bodies in the city of Adelma, embodying the living and the dead. Splendor in the city of Clarisse, incorporating past destruction. And debris in the city of Leonia, flooding back from the outskirts. And in Landomia, he saw the dead, living and unborn, jammed in the pores of stones. What an arresting imagery. So in this imagery of durational time, we are led to the secretions of urban design and technicity, to shadow signs of the past present, the untimely contemporary of Agamben, in my view. So let's explore then what this chronicity implies in terms of the urban foreclosures that I opened with. In the global north, the short-lived time of urban planning for generalized well-being has come to an end. Universalist projects, whether the utopian dreams of planners and architects, or the housing, infrastructural, and welfare projects of democratic authorities, are under strain. In part, I think this is because cities everywhere are being scarred by major existential challenges, testing the urban machinery of supply, shelter, and security, and leaving majorities and minorities alike exposed to the recurring hazards of disease, climate change, warfare, and broken infrastructures and institutions. A new era of perpetual risk seems to be making the survival of urban populations very much a lottery, an end without means, something that the South, of course, the global South, has long had to live with. And in this landscape of existential instability is arising a new biopolitics of urban capture, manifest in the grab of urban assets by elites to secure the volatile future for themselves, to protect themselves from the insurrections of the dispossessed. So to older repertoires of control and marginalization of the poor are being added new maneuvers to claim urban value through deprivations of land and property, the commodification of everything, extensive surveillance, capture of imminent potential, and the colonization of public institutions and infrastructures. I think this is what's really going on in many cities of the world when we look at how power is reworking cities. So an urban past, when power allowed majorities some access to the city and allowed marginals to lead their own lives, I think is giving way to a time of reappropriation of whatever is considered to be the operative landscape. The logic is predatory, looking to harness the common for private gain and to rein in, to bring in dangerous excess as developers and investors and public authorities unite to remake or get rid of popular neighborhoods. So these moves, I think, threaten the already and the not yet that Agamben refers to, the already and the not yet of social anticipation in popular neighborhoods, where interactions with familiar strangers, a history of improvisation, old technicities of making and shifting, and certain intimacies of place, familiarities of place, have historically helped residents to make something out of very little. So I think what we're seeing today in terms of the new predations, the new colonization of the city, I think the threat is very, very real and truly consequential if it comes to pass. And yet we also know that the history of urban colonization is full of errors, it's full of flaws, it's full of remainders and contra-times. The predations never quite take in everything, are often subverted, they come with inefficiencies and blunders, and they fall short of snuffing out the life world. This much is clear from the many studies of popular life in southern informal settlements and working class neighborhoods in the global north, identifying habits of surface scanning and environmental adjustment as a mode of survival. Preparedness here rests on incipience, on making the future, however uncertain, in the gaps of the difficult present. Okay, now something seems to have happened here. And my slideshow will not move. I don't quite know what to do.
So could you just stop the slideshow and then again share? No, now it's moving.
Is it?
Yeah. Your next slide is foreclosures residues.
Yeah, but even if I try to move it again, it's not going to happen.
In popular, yes, sir. We are seeing that it's moving in popular neighborhoods.
Okay, so I wanted to go back. All right,
Yes.
let's see what happens. This is all going nuts, but let's see. So, as Abdul Malik Simone, who's part of our group, explains, places are marked by enduring traces of prolonged trauma and vitality, whose residual reverberations are slow to dissipate. What we have in these neighborhoods, these places, is, quoting Evans-Orr, is an incontinence of memory, which populates every domain with its menagerie of ghosts and demons and spirits, all of which provide an invisible yet material backdrop to what disparate peoples might do with each other. There is an intricate architecture of both ethical and strategic decisions. How much needs to be said or shown? How vulnerable is one in the face of uncertain prospects? What responsibility does one take for the lives of others? And so on. So I think what there is here is this, the argument here is that habitation rests on unanticipated, unprogrammed ways of organization and surfaces of contact and exploration that bring situations and actors into generative proximity. So for Simone, the surface, its textures and angles and trajectories, leads residents into specific scenarios and not others. It's the medium in which the future performs in people's knowledge about what is to come, whether it'll rain tomorrow or how to modify your itinerary, whether water will come out of the tap, and so on. So what Simone seems to be saying here is that in popular neighborhoods, no matter how much contestation and erasure is going on, in these urban surrounds, in the ungoverned places, tomorrow is anticipated in reading and writing the surface because there is not much else to rely on. The future rests on working the daily fabric of place and in the perennial call and response with proximate others that comes with no guarantees, of course. It is in inhabited time, in lived time, that the future unfolds. Agamben's contemporary, pragmatically anticipating, somehow domesticating the foreclosed future. Now, there's a big question here, whether such future-making contemporariness in the present can survive the new biopolitics and the new geopolitics of urban repossession, which is tearing down the fabric of informality, is anybody's guess. It's an open question. But I think the imperative, nonetheless, to work the surface for survival is not going to go away. If anything, it is going to become more and more intense. Now, we get a glimpse of this in a place where the Italian sociologist Enrica Morlicchio and I have spent a year studying the habitation practices of African migrants and displaced Neapolitans, stuck in what we call a middle time of deprivation and stigmatization. And this place is Castelvolturno on the coast north of Naples, once a place of second homes by the sea, Roman castles and villas, and still very much a place of exotic palms, rare ibis, pine groves, and vast fields of tomatoes and farms of buffaloes. But behind this bucolic, pristine veneer lies a recent history of extensive pollution by illegal discharges of effluents, toxic landfill sites controlled by the Neapolitan mafia known as the Camorra, speculative build that has fallen to ruin, sweated black labor in the fields and construction sites, absolutely inefficient and corrupt government, an extensive drug economy, a sex trade relying on enslaved young African women, and far from adequate opportunities in the formal economy. In Castelvolturno, illegality and criminality underpin everything, from operations in the dominant economic activities and status of migrant employees to the tentacles of the Camorra in building construction, housing occupancy, and service infrastructures. For these reasons, Castelvolturno has earned the label the Black Heart of Naples, attracting a disproportionate number of sensational films and novels further stigmatizing its character as an inferno and an infernal settlement. Castelvolturno is a place of ruination, manifest in its decrepit villas and abandoned neighborhoods, which are inhabited by migrants but also poor Neapolitans, and in the absence of infrastructures behind the one or two principal roads. In the hinterland, there are no buses or road names, and there are very few public facilities and services. As one resident ruminates when we interviewed him, this is what he said: after 7 p.m., there's no one to be seen out and about. Castelvolturno becomes a ghost town, and in winter, you can't even go out. At 5 o'clock, it's all dark. It's scary to go out, because in the streets, there's no public lighting. You don't know who you might encounter. If there is daylight, you can go out, but when it's dark, we lock ourselves inside. So around illegality and ruination has grown a race-coded narrative blaming African migrants for Castelvolturno's decline, forgetting how their labor, rents, and bondage sustain the area's principal trades. There is an official looseness with statistics which allows the authorities to circulate random numbers, claiming the number of migrants in Castelvolturno to be between 15 and 25,000 people, more than half of the resident population, whereas social surveys put this number at less than 20% of the population, which nonetheless is still quite high for Italy. And today, Nigerians and Ghanaians make up more than half of the foreign population, followed at a distance by Ukrainians, Poles, Romanians, Gambians, and Togolese. Amongst this largest group, there are those who arrived, by that I mean the Nigerians and Ghanaians, there are those who arrived over 30 years ago and have spent most of their lives in Castelvolturno, those who were born there, and those who arrived just a few months ago. Their lives are suspended in the sense of withheld work contracts and rights of residency, entrapment in dirty and tightly controlled work, and waiting forever for elusive work that never leads to anything, no rights. And also confinement to the space-times of segregation and non-recognition. Clandestine survival that at any moment could lead to expulsion. And yet, in the crushed blackness, in the blackness of crushed personhood, to go back to Agamben and Simone, another more generative form of blackness has grown, enabled by migrant inhabitation of the already and the not yet, surfaces of unrecognition and foreclosure. In suspended existence, time has become textured by black agency. The early years of violence in the fields and brothels have been halted by migrant protests and the campaigns of the church and social movements. This is the violence of a migrant camp in Villa l'Eterno, near Castelvolturno, burnt down in September 1994. The Camorra murder in August 1989 of Jerry Maslow, an anti-apartheid activist who woke up one day in the fields and was simply killed. The massacre of 5 other migrants a year later in another place called Pesco Pagano, and then of 6 young Africans in 1998 in Lago Patria. It is also the violence in the 1980s and 1990s of young women trafficked from Ghana and Nigeria as sexual slaves in Castelvolturno's brothels called connection houses, owned by women called madams, who paid for the journey of these young women. And these are young women who were then unable to flee without money or official papers, terrorized by curses of black magic, which will harm you and your family back home, grateful for the protection of other working girls. But interestingly, after years of campaign, especially from various Catholic orders, the sex trade has declined, and some women have managed to pay off or escape their entrapment, of course, still fearful of of African mafia reprisals. If the most brazen forms of racial violence have disappeared, other denials keep Africans in the shadows. The bodies filling the fields and construction sites, the buses to Naples, and abandoned neighborhoods are phantom subjects. They glide before dawn and after dusk for labor. They live apart, and the Africans avoid Castelvolturno's public spaces. They are not seen. They're only talked about as a corrupting presence, despite their economic centrality. But shadow life offers what one young Nigerian told us, I quote, a darkness in which you can hide your tears. In this darkness, Africans have learned to bear time by making way with others, finding in adversity cause for another outcome, building home in the uninhabitable. For example, second-generation Africans now with residential rights and supportive families and some educational qualifications are learning as African Italians, no longer as migrants without papers, to move forward with rights, to look past the condescensions of the white eye, the occhio bianco. And then for the older generation, some in their fourth decade of residence, time itself has brought some reliefs of cohabitation. At critical moments, the help of civic organizations and religious missions such as the Centro Fernandez, with food and shelter and residency and applications, has played their part. But it is in blackness that a habitus of resumption has grown. A habitus that is formed in expanding numbers, of growing and cementing friendship and ethnic connections, in the growth of shadow pleasures, of sites of shadow pleasure and care, the comforts of prayer, the little Africa of shops, mosques, and congregations that are springing up in Castelvolturno. But of course, we cannot be too romantic about these things. The place still remains a habitus tested by denial and maltreatment. One Ghanaian, Kojo, told us, I quote, I have seen people going mad without documents, stuck in a place with nowhere to meet, eating and drinking alone, living in abandoned houses without electricity, without money. These tests keep Castelvolturno's African arrivals, recent and old, I quote, shackled by an excess of relentless reality. What a great phrase, okay? Shackled by an excess of relentless reality, as Hans Lucht puts it. Hans Lucht has done almost 20 years of ethnographic research in Castelvolturno. Yet in the fortitude gained from enduring perilous journeys across Africa, rejected asylum applications, enduring precarious and dirty work and poor housing conditions, and of course always denied rights, what has remained is, to quote Simondon, a certain kind of livingness, a livingness of always resuming, of resumption, a refusal of dehumanization. Now, another set of migrants in Castelvolturno are Neapolitans squatting illegally in abandoned estates, such as Parco Saraceno, which is that image that you see. These people too are poor, unregistered, and invisible. And they too have found ways of texturing suspension in cohabitation. But this time as citizens who look backwards, who are nostalgic for a lost past, while in contrast, the Castelvolturno's Africans look ahead, and always only ahead, because they have no illusions of a past or have no illusions of rights. Parco Saraceno is a housing speculation of the late 1960s of the influential Coppola family. 12,000 apartments were planned to be surrounded by good services, health centers, schools, a cinema, a police station, restaurants, and a luxury tourist port. Wealthy Neapolitans would cohabit in Parco Saraceno. It was intended with American soldiers stationed at the NATO complex in this, what was called Italian Miami. And in no time, the Parco Saraceno dream crumbled. And the plans were only half realized. Their legality was contested by the authorities because this was speculative building. And this resulted in blocked build, severed basic services, buildings falling into disrepair, and then slowly the apartments that were there being illegally rented out. And then in the 1980s, the NATO base closed, attracting Neapolitan families who were trying to escape earthquakes or earth tremors in Naples, or high living costs in Naples, or indeed also choosing to serve their house arrest in a place by the sea rather than a narrow street in the center of Naples. And in these early years, the dare to squat, to occupy illegally, paid off. The buildings were in good condition. The apartments came with marble flooring, very well-equipped large kitchens and terraces facing the sea. Moving to Parco Saraceno seemed a good solution, financially and otherwise. The squatters could avoid or could pay low rents to distant owners. They could pirate water and electricity. And their economic precarity was eased, of course, by these savings of getting things free. But they also came together as a community through all kinds of squatter solidarities and complicities and sociabilities. There's a lovely documentary film on Parco Saraceno called Ritratti Abusivi, in which one early resident recalls thinking back, I quote, "All the doors were open, and you could barely tell who were the parents of the children scattered everywhere." And then also in Leonardi's podcast, Il Mio Posto, the protagonist Claudia looks back on her 20 years in Parco Saraceno before she moved away as a time when if a person didn't have money for groceries, to avoid offending them, we would go to their home and say, "Look, I made meatballs. There was some left for you. Why don't you have these?" But of course, we had made these on purpose. Says Claudia, this was my place in Neapolitan dialect, o posto mio. But this kind of, let's call it congenial, nostalgic habitus was not to last. Today, after rounds of evictions and departures out of desperation, Parco Saraceno has become ghostly. The fabric of outlaw horizontal relations has been torn by degradation and abandonment, unmasking the fantasies of rogue citizenship. Over time, the buildings crumbled and social ties fractured as early settlers were replaced by the hyper-poor, by drug addicts and petty criminals. Days after the last eviction in December 2024, all that Enrica could see, my collaborator, were empty homes and abandoned toys, furniture, and Christmas decorations on the street. If life is returning to the empty homes, its only signs are the cracked bottles, the dustpan and brush in the corner, the Tetra Pak of very bad wine next to somebody's unmade bed. The new ghosts of Parco Saraceno are furtive individuals who kind of come by night, if you like, not the outlaws in broad daylight who dared to squat as citizens, as Neapolitan Italian citizens, white Italian citizens, making rights claims. So, to come to a slightly long conclusion, the unraveling of Parco Saraceno exposed the fragility of outlaw citizenship. As the buildings crumbled, as crime and violence increased, and as the evictions and Camorra threats intensified, the fabric of nostalgia unraveled, undoing the community ties that held things together. Ironically, Castelvolturno's Africans have never pretended citizenship. They've been denied work and residency permits. They've been unable to access social benefits. And they've not dared to pirate services or squat as illegal subjects because they would simply be kicked out. They know that their social ties provide a resting place, some degree of legitimacy in unrecognition, but not a permit to claim a right in the way that the white displaced Neapolitans were doing. So this is how I read the notes of friendship that you find amongst blacks in Castelvolturno, in the shared houses, in the drinking dens, and in crowded buses, in the joys of watching Nigerian soaps and listening to Afrobeats in Musa's barbershop. A kind of wistful congregation in mosques and churches. It is a kind of, these are notes of friendship, which are notes of friendship known to be without permanence. But in suspended time, a black social infrastructure has also formed. This is the interesting thing. While displaced Neapolitans relied on an unstable right to claim public goods, the displaced Neapolitans didn't make the effort to create a social infrastructure of survival. They relied on their kind of citizenship rights to stake a claim. Over the years, Africans have found legal, practical, and spiritual support from missions such as the Centro Fernandez or community organizations such as the one named after Jerry Maslow, the anti-apartheid South African who was killed. Social enterprises are springing up, such as a place called Black and White, which offers after-school activities for kids, different forms of training. We have businesses such as Made in Castelvolturno, which helps Nigerian women to learn sewing skills. There is the Miriam Makeba Arts Association. Miriam Makeba, the great South African singer, died in Castelvolturno at the end of a concert in the 90s. You have clinics such as Emergency, offering health advice to migrants. And an important venture for black youth is a place called Tam Tam, which offers basketball training. And a lot of Tam Tam kids, Tam Tam has won many regional basketball competitions. It's quite a remarkable outfit. So to be sure, this black infrastructure is rudimentary, it's disconnected, but it plays its part in a place offering no social support, no official support to its African residents. Recently, Brian Masumi has revisited the term para-institution to valorize, quote, sustained practices in the register of the micropolitical that build upon and enhance each other without institutionalizing themselves. Of course, he is referring here to various forms and intensities of civic mobilization, which for him, in the shadow of power, often enough leave traces in, I quote, in the mute, silent background operations of technicity bustling with a form of quasi-chaos. I think we can think of the displays of survivalist organization in remaindered spaces such as Castel Volturno as examples of this technicity. The artifices of makeshift, of affective, emotional autonomy, and also civic organization, circulating in the mute background as a form of social power. And this circulation, it's important to know of this circulation, because as the tone of formal politics becomes more and more one-sided, the street, virtual and real, I think is returning as a theatre of affective politics, the place of popular expression of what and for whom the city and nation are for. On it, the street, of course, the forces are decidedly uneven, with those of nastiness very much amplified by the shock troops of the far right, supported by illiberal states and opportunist media and business oligarchs, while the forces of decency forever wait for the backing of law, government, and an inclusive political narrative. And of course, as we know, there is no backing these days in the collapse of the liberal order, no harness from the macro institutions of liberal politics. Perhaps then, the way forward lies in the para-institutional, the coalescence of anarchies of self-organization in the ever-expanding urban world of remaindered life. Their words, their sensoria, their technicities of another kind of demand. And if you like, a demand for a more care-laden future, which might pressure, who knows, one day, might pressure the macro-political to move with these demands. Reflecting on the post-colonial African condition of being nothing, of always being available, of being the sucker in the farce, Abdurrahman Sek reminds us how in this condition, being, I quote, is already to be in the midst of sharing, of already participating, not to simply reside in a solitary crowd. It comes with a practical sense to sit down together, in other words, to be capable of cultivating sociality. This way of being offers a possibility to, I quote again, to transform everyday tools and forms of knowledge into legitimate and equitable political resources that express social ties, largely held by everyone. We could think of the urban remaindered in the same way. The examples that I've given of African life in Castel Volturno, and to a degree also white displaced Neapolitan life in Castel Volturno. We could think of the remaindered urban in the same way as the shadow negotiations of foreclosure, in which a certain grammar of improvisation, a certain grammar of sociality, a certain grammar of foregoing, of giving up in order to get ahead, where the untimely relations we might see them as prefigurative of another urbanism in our suffocating existential momentum. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that very engaging lecture. We will now take questions from our questions and comments from our participants. You can either put them in the chat box or use the raise hand button.
Madhubanti, while others think, can I ask Ash something?
Yes, please, sir. Please.
Ash, I was listening to you, and my inquiry is that in this kind of unstable condition, what is the overall experience of the social infrastructure of solidarity, or let's say informal schools in refugee settlements or the settlements that you describe? do they, at any point of time, are they incorporated in city planning, or do they leave some relatively lasting impact on the city, or they remain only a segregated, kind of a secluded, out there on the periphery, kind of an outlying experience and not modifying the urban experience as a whole?
Thank you for your question, Anabi. Nice to see you again. I think a lot depends on where you find yourself. So in Castel Volturno, where the official structures of politics and planning are so decidedly centralized, corrupt, and authoritarian, these social infrastructures exist on the margins, and despite and probably in response to closure. And there, historically, the role of more radical civic movements and the missionary church have been quite fundamental. And so your question is really about what kind of traces do they leave? They leave no official trace in terms of shifting official practice and discourse, but they leave an informal trace. The centers, yes, they open and close, but somebody else will come along. The church missions especially, although the left social movements have collapsed, the church organizations, they have a certain kind of obduracy, they have a certain stubbornness to stick around and be there, especially for the African people. They were absolutely central in outlawing sexual slavery, and they were absolutely central in calling for justice against the killing of the young African men. So that there's a sort of something lingers there, right? It's hard to know what exactly it is, other than appearing and disappearing social institutions. But I started off by saying it all depends where you are. In Naples city center, things are very different. So, for instance, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a left mayoralty. The regime has been much more kind of popularly oriented. At one hand, interested in gentrification. On the other hand, making sure what can be done about the lives of poor Neapolitans. And in the last few years, especially, the deputy mayor of Naples, she's a professional planner who works at the university with a long history of engagement in what you call the quartieri, the popular neighborhoods of Naples. She's made it a point to work with social movements scattered around the city. This is a city which, again, in deprivation, has a long history of social movements, of very effective social movements, whether around theater or anti-poverty campaigns or the revitalization of the built environment. And so there you see quite a positive relationship, a two-way relationship unfolding between the official world of urban planning and urban politics and the unofficial world of this sea of social movements trying to do something about the poor in some shape or form.
Thank you, Professor. We have a question from Kajori Shorkar, who has requested that you explain the concept of double blackness once again, if possible. Thank you.
Yeah. So there is you will be aware, at least in the United States, a very rich literature on blackness, which looks back historically, but also in the contemporary so-called urban surrounds, peripheral urban spaces, to make sense of this awkward combination of a long history of violence, of dispossession, of deprivation, from the kind of plantation legacies, to responses by black communities of refusal, of saying that, I will not be crushed. I mean, in some ways, the Black Panther movement is a good example. The Nation of Islam is a good example. And I'm also here thinking of Saadia Hatman's wonderful writing, a book called Wayward Lives, which is about, at the turn of the last century, young African American women developing, leading, going to cities and leading these kind of wayward lives of refusing the terms of subjugation, of refusing the labels imposed on how they should be behaving, and therefore, living much more vicariously, participating in music, making music, and so on and so forth, and of course becoming involved in all forms of political action. So, and of course, in our own CIFAR group, the presence of Abdul Malik Simon has been really quite central because of his writing on blackness, as both this kind of simultaneously situation of denial, but also vivid expression, and in which, in the forms of expression, there might be prefigurative, as I'm trying to say in this lecture, of another way of living, of a more kind of solidaristic way of living and being in the world. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Hanif Rahman. And Hanif is asking, can the condition in Castel Volturno be seen as the decline of urban spaces? And is it correlated with the inability of the government to preserve social and political capacity?
I don't quite know how to answer that question directly, but I'll say this. What I think Castel Volturno is illustrative of is, again, something with a very kind of interesting double face. One is, what is it that happens in systemic and systematic ruination of a place for whatever reason? Where once prosperous places, once viable places enter a slow and long process of ruination of the built environment, of social relations, of the corruption of power, of the things that I mentioned at the start of my talk. And how in ruination, other forms of life prop up, because in ruination, certain subaltern communities can hide, can develop new ways of life, can, if you like, lead a life which doesn't make such high demands on the purse, where there are certain kind of informalities, informal forms of organization that present themselves because everything else doesn't provide or is ruined. So the key in this dual nature of ruination, as removal but also affordance, I think the key institution there is what formal politics, formal infrastructures, and formal planning does in that situation. And in Castel Volturno, it's been really interesting that the formal response to ruination has been to live with it, to, in a sense, extract from it rent and opportunity, right? Because ruination in the form of illegality and corruption, this, that, and the other, keeps the agricultural economy going, keeps profits made out of environmental destruction going, keeps the rental market of illegal occupation of buildings going. There's money to be made from ruination. Whereas in other urban contexts, it may well turn out to be that the official response to ruination is, well, this won't do. This is not good. That we should try and deal with ruination in all of its phases, from destruction of the built environment through to different forms of illegality and corruption. And what happens there, when you get efforts to clean up the environment, to regulate the environment, to make it good, again, is always very double-faced, right? I mean, sometimes you get to this kind of cleaning up becomes a form of eviction of all that is considered to be dirt, defined sociologically, or decisions made very much in favor of the elites and the middle classes. So I think I suppose these formal efforts to deal with ruination, I think often also come with their own kind of biases.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Akshay, I think. Akshay, could you unmute yourself and ask the question yourself?
Yes,
that
I can
would be better.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
So I think this question has been answered to some extent, but I was wondering, when you suggest blackness by some means allows for a sociality that assumedly those in Bangkok Saraceno did not find. Does this come from the experience of migrancy, or is it? You've talked a little bit about the Nation of Islam, the Black Panthers, who are also able to build this kind of fabric. And Abdul Malik Simon talks about this in one of his other essays about Johannesburg as well. So I was wondering where you think this possibility of sociality comes from, and why it does not exist for those in Pakistan.
That's a great question. Thank you. I can only talk about the places that I know about. And in Castel Volturno, the sociality has come from, in part, as a kind of strategy of survival with growing also numbers of people from your own kind of region or country. And, it develops in a very fragile way through friendship and cohabitation and music and little shops springing up and so on and so forth. And then a later stage in that sociality, I suppose, because this first form of sociality is very ephemeral. It kind of comes and goes. And it's so dependent on the existential condition that people find themselves in. But the second stage in Castel Volturno was, in a sense, came from outside. I said in the talk, the role of the missions, like the Centro Fernandez and other Catholic organizations, which had always been aligned to the church militant type of philosophy in the 70s and the 80s, has been really quite pivotal. And they sort of provided let's call it an institutional infrastructure around which these other first forms of sociality could find voice and coalesce, find expression, and a medium through which then the grievances could be made public, if you like. The killing of Africans in the fields, for instance, or the violence against them, or the sexual slavery stories. So that was the second phase in which, with help from, in inverted commas, outside of the community, a new layer, a second layer of social infrastructure or infrastructure of sociality formed, came into place, again, always very fragile. And I think a third phase now has been that some of this has become instituted with small seed corn money coming in from different sources, to set up centers like Tam or Emergency, which provides care for the African community, and other if you like, interventions in the provision of welfare, sometimes, legal services, which are crucially important when the chances of you as a black person in Naples or elsewhere in Italy to get residency or work permits is near to impossible. And so I think the roots here towards sociality are, of course, very, very different from those that we know of in Black America. Where in a sense the struggle came very much from within, this slow maturation, the entry into political life. It's a story that, of course, you'll be well familiar with. But the story in Castelvolturno, where you are forever the migrant, you are forever the outside, you're forever the unrecognized. There, I think the story of the infrastructures is one in which is one of cautious, slow progress with lots and lots of reversals. And still today, if I've given the picture of a solid structure of black alterity being put into place in Castelvolturno, that would be entirely wrong. That's just simply not the case.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think we have one last question from Reza Kazemi. Reza, could you also please unmute yourself and ask the question, if that's okay?
Yes, of course. Hello for our professor. I want to ask you a question that what is the main factor that caused the poor housing conditional? As in the slide of professor, it's shown that the poor housing condition is the one of the most factor that caused this problem. If the professor can describe more for me, it's very good. Thank you.
Okay. So, two forms of poor housing conditions. One is those in Naples during the 80s and the 90s, in narrow streets, expanding rents, yes, work available in the informal economy, but pretty poor housing conditions, with often people living, entire families living in what are called bassi, one-room apartments on the ground floor of a very polluted city. So there, the poor housing conditions became a sort of a stimulus to leave, to get out and go to Castelvolturno, because in Castelvolturno, whether it's Parca Saraceno or other places, because of ruination, because of building speculation, which was blocked by the authorities, the built environment, the housing went into ruin in the way that I tried to describe. And so people could then, the white Neapolitans could escape to Castelvolturno to make positive use of very bad housing conditions in order not to pay rents and in order to pirate electricity and water and the rest. And if the services outside the house were not that good, well, in a way, it didn't really matter so much, because the conditions inside the house were not too bad and you were living with people like yourselves. The very same poor housing conditions in Castelvolturno, again, there's a good story behind that. It's not so much poor housing conditions, but you had a built environment of different kinds of villas, right? Not just ancient ones, but solid structures, let's put it there, in spacious surroundings. Again, going to ruination in Castelvolturno, because, make no mistake, there's a lot of money being made in Castelvolturno in the mozzarella industry, the tomato industry, in the fields, of course, in the drug economy, in sexual slavery, and so on. but it was a fertile economy that didn't really necessarily depend on or need good housing conditions. In fact, it needed exactly the opposite. It needed bad housing conditions so that, the workers in these different economic sectors could, at low rents, find accommodation. And so for the Black Africans in Castel Volturno, the poor quality of the built environment allowed different forms of segregation to grow, different communities to live in different areas of this quite large landscape, to a degree also a forested landscape, in which you could find a space for yourself without a huge amount of backlash from the authorities. That's an interesting aspect of Castel Volturno, that because of its particular sort of inefficient governance history, there were not many clearances. So I guess my answer to your question is that there's a paradox here, that it's the poor housing conditions that actually made habitable life possible for very poor people.
Thank you, sir. I think there are no other questions. So with that, we come to an end of today's session. We are very grateful to you, Professor Amin, and to Professor Hari Sharma for, agreeing to serve as resource persons for our course despite your very busy schedules. A very big thank you to all the participants for attending the lectures and actively engaging with them through your questions and comments. The readings for the next week will again be uploaded on the Google Classroom. Please keep an eye on the Classroom tab. If you have any questions during the week about the course, or any questions that you would like to ask to the resource persons, please feel free to write to me or my colleague, CIFAR. Thank you, and bye-bye. Have a great evening.